This man's name is Brad, the owner of a non-profit organization focusing on raising funds for charity. That morning, while eating at a restaurant with one of his employees, out of the blue, his employee said that he wanted to resign. He explained that at his age now, he can make much more money than working at Brad's company, or maybe he can set up a fundraising company like Brad too, but much more successful because he was still young. Brad felt like he was slapped with those words. That night, he couldn't sleep at all thinking about the chat this afternoon. Brad reminisced about the time when he was just starting his business. He thought that how come he couldn't get all the success he wanted despite being in the business for decades, way different from his far more accomplished best friends. At that moment, he felt like a failure. He kept overthinking everything. He remembered the reunion he had with his friends. One of them had become a famous director in Hollywood. One had a big company. One worked in the government and often appeared on TV, and the other one even had retired, enjoying his investment money. Compared to his life, he felt like a loser. He was very jealous when in fact his family was not lacking anything. Even though his business was small, but the economy was stable, his wife's job was also good. He had a car and a nice house, and his only son was well-behaved and performed well at school. He was just jealous when he compared his life with his friends. The next day, he accompanied his son to visit Boston to apply for college. At the airport, while waiting for the plane schedule, like fathers and sons in general, the two of them didn't seem close enough. So while waiting, they just stayed silent. Brad tried to start a conversation, but it didn't work that well. He then told his son to try to change their economy class tickets for VIP tickets. Troy smiled happily after hearing that because he had never been on a VIP class flight before, but when checked, the customer service said that Brad's tickets could not be exchanged because he bought them using a discount coupon. He was disappointed and embarrassed. When he got on the plane, Brad overthinking about something. He pondered if his successful friends had ever taken the economy class flight. Brad also remembered that at the reunion, his friends told him that they had a private jet or at least took a VIP class plane if they needed it. Once again, Brad was envious. He then remembered that when he was in college, he was one of the smart students who had the ambition to be a successful person, while his wife was just a humble woman who was grateful for whatever she had. She never asked for more than what they had, but because of that, since marrying her, he felt that his ambition had disappeared, unlike the wives of his friends who had high ambitions because they were also successful women. Brad was sure that one of the factors in his friend's success must be the influence of their wives. As soon as they arrived in Boston, Brad immediately reserved a room in the hotel and took a rest after the long trip. That night at the restaurant, Brad asked which campus Troy wanted to register for. Troy answered that he really wanted to enroll at Harvard University art major because his high school teacher once said that with his skill at playing the piano, Troy deserved to enter such a prestigious university like Harvard, especially because there is also his idol musician who is now a lecturer at there. Brad smiled proudly as he listened to the story. He just found out that all this time his son was good at playing the piano. At the hotel, Brad kept looking at his son. He didn't expect that the child he raised had a bright future ahead of him. He started thinking this might be his way to make up for his lost ambition. He will be very proud when his son graduates from such a prestigious campus as Harvard and becomes a famous musician. Brad was very sure that even though his friends were rich, their children were not necessarily as good as Troy. At that very moment, all the envies in his heart suddenly vanished. The next day, Brad took Troy to attend the admission at Harvard. He couldn't wait to hear the test result. Soon after, Troy came out with bad news. Apparently, he had the wrong schedule. The schedule for his interview was yesterday, and now the registration had closed. Hearing that, Brad was very disappointed. Outside, Brad kept thinking about how to make his son get another chance to register. He then called his wife, Melanie, and asked if she was acquainted with any lecturer, alumni, or maybe an insider who could help get Troy to Harvard. Melanie then suggested that he ask for help from one of his college friends named Craig, because Craig worked in the government and might have a good relationship with someone there. Brad was reluctant to do that. Back then, when Brad had just started his business, he went to Craig and asked him to be his investor, but Craig seemed demeaning to him. Not only that, when Brad sent email to ask about how he is, he never replied, as if he had become arrogant and forgotten him. After years of staying away from him, Brad was reluctant to ask for help from Craig again. But even though his heart refused, for the sake of his son being able to enter Harvard, Brad forced himself to keep his ego away. He then called one of his friends to ask for Craig's number. When he was making small talk, Brad's friend was showing off his successful life, that he now lived in a mansion in Hawaii with his two beautiful girlfriends. The envies in his heart returned, but he knew that it was not the time to feel jealous. After getting Craig's number, he immediately called him, but unfortunately, the number was not active, so he left a voice message and asked Craig to call him back if he had time. The next day, while having breakfast at the restaurant, Craig called him. At that moment, Brad told him about the problem he had at Harvard yesterday. He then asked Craig to help his son so that he would still be allowed to register even though the registration had closed. As an old friend, Craig didn't mind. It so happened that the day after tomorrow, Craig also had a business in Boston, so he would be able to help him. He then invited Brad to meet and have dinner at a restaurant. Hearing that Craig wanted to help, he was very happy. He was sure that his son would definitely enter Harvard University. Brad then invited Troy to go to the bookstore. There, Craig called him back and said that he had succeeded in persuading Harvard to allow Troy to have an interview tomorrow. After the call was finished, Brad immediately told the good news to Troy. He was happy to see the happiness in his son's face. He started imagining that in the future, Troy could become a famous musician and put an honor in his family name. Despite the good things in his mind, he started overthinking again, like what if in the future, Troy fails to become a famous musician and instead becomes a street busker. He was afraid that because of his son's failure, his friends would demean him even more. He kept thinking about it all day. That night, Troy invited his father to meet his senior from high school, who was also a student at Harvard, Ananya. Troy said that he used to perform in an orchestra at a charity event with her. The three of them then had dinner together at a restaurant. While having a deep conversation, Brad was amazed by the beauty and bright aura that radiated from Ananya. In the middle of the conversation, Ananya's friend named Maya came and joined them. Seeing the two beautiful and passionate women in front of him, he was just speechless and fascinated. He remembered the first time he met his wife. She also had a bright aura like them, full of passion, but after years of marriage, the passion had now dimmed. Brad remembered the friend he called when asked for Craig's number yesterday. His friend said that he lived in a luxurious mansion in Hawaii with his two beautiful girlfriends. Suddenly, Brad's wild thoughts appeared. He wondered if he is successful and had a lot of money, he surely could also have two beautiful girlfriends like his friend, and he would want both of his girlfriends to be passionate and beautiful women like Ananya and Maya, not like his wife at home. After dinner, Ananya invited Brad to continue chatting at the bar across the street with her friends. Brad initially wanted to join, but after Troy refused because he was not old enough to go there, and moreover, he also had to go for an interview. Brad was forced to refuse the invitation. At the hotel, after Troy slept, Bard secretly went to the bar to meet Ananya at the bar. The two of them talked at length for hours. Because they were so drunk, Brad started talking about his life, which was very sad compared to the life of his successful friends. Brad hoped as he vented his anxiety, Ananya might cheer him up like his friends' wives, not like his wife at home, but beyond his expectation, Ananya actually didn't show any sympathy at all. She instead said that life was hard out there. There are lots of people whose lives are much poorer, they couldn't even afford to eat. The people whom Brad thought had a perfect life might actually have a lot of big problems, so comparing one's life was not a wise thing to do. Life is not a sport that has to compete to win, because life is not a competition. Hearing what the young woman said, Brad couldn't say anything in return. Before parting, Ananya invited Brad to watch her orchestral music concert tomorrow night. The next morning, Brad took Troy to Harvard to attend the admission. While waiting for him, he did not forget to tell his wife about Troy's current condition. Shortly after, the interview was finished. Troy said that thanks to the person his father contacted, he was welcomed and was sure that he would be accepted. Brad was very happy that finally his son could study at a prestigious university. The two of them then went to register at Tufts University in case Troy's registration at Harvard didn't work out. He told Troy that Tufts was the university where he used to study. When Troy was walking around, Brad stopped by a room to greet his supervisor, but Brad was told that his supervisor had passed away. Brad was shocked because nobody informed him. He thought that his friends did that because he was not as accomplished as them. At night at the hotel, Brad was getting ready to meet Craig. At the restaurant, the waitress gave Brad a table near the kitchen door, which was noisy with the sound of people passing by. Shortly after, Craig came. Seeing an important person like Craig, the waitress greeted him kindly and gave him a special table in the middle, even offering Craig a special drink. After the waitress left, the two old friends started chatting and reminiscing about the past, not forgetting, Brad also thanked Craig for helping Troy to enter one of the most famous universities in the world. Minutes passed, and they both kept sharing their stories until suddenly, the atmosphere changed. They started talking about the news of their friends. While laughing arrogantly, Craig started to uncover the secret disgrace of his friends one by one. He said that he was the only one that had become successful, while the others' lives were not as amazing as Brad imagined. They had their own big problems. One of them was almost jailed because of tax evasion, the other one's child was seriously ill and needed immediate surgery to keep her alive, and the other one had failed an investment and then fled to Hawaii. Moreover, the private planes that they often flaunt were actually not their own plane, but a plane from the company's money they embezzled. All the stories of Craig left Brad shocked in disbelief at that moment. He kept responding to the story, but his mind was somewhere else. He pondered all of his friends' accomplishments and thought that having such prestige didn't mean happiness at all. He started wondering if Craig also had a secret disgrace that he tried to hide. Brad felt like he was slapped by reality. It turned out that all this time his life has been all right. He might not have as much money as them, but his family is happy. He didn't have a penny in debt. His son is healthy and well-behaved, and his company, even though it was just a small company, had been running smoothly for decades and had many good relations. At that moment, Brad felt like an idiot. Just because he wanted to look successful, he forced everything so that his son could enter Harvard, even asking for help from an arrogant friend who used to belittle him. Until this second, Craig had never once apologized. In the middle of the conversation, Brad exploded. He, who was respectful to Craig at first, suddenly poured all his heartache with anger. Brad abruptly left the restaurant and decided to join Troy to watch Ananya and Maya's orchestral performances. He explained to Troy that he'd rather be with him. The beautiful music from Ananya and Maya transported Brad into feeling emotional and reflective, realizing that he should have been grateful for what he had. After returning to the hotel, Troy suddenly said that he wasn't going to Harvard. This afternoon, while touring his father's alma mater, he thought it would be better for him to study there. The place is nice, the lecturers are kind, and the students who study there are also friendly. Troy then asked if his father was having a nervous breakdown. Seeing his son's worried about him, Brad finally told all his thoughts. All this time, he was afraid of what people thought about him. He had doubts that people might call him a failure. Hearing that, Troy replied that he once thought the same thing. He thought that people who saw him would remember his mistake forever, and he would constantly hold back his embarrassment, but in reality, it never happened. Even though his mistake was embarrassing, it turned out that people didn't really care because everyone was just busy thinking about themselves, so now Troy was not so afraid of what other people thought of him. He hoped that his father could do the same. Instead of worrying about other people's opinions, it was better to think about what the people who cared about us thought of us. and the only person who cared about Brad was his family. Brad then asked what his son thought of him. Troy answered that he loved him. Hearing that put a smile on Brad's face. He was touched and mollified by those words. While sleeping, Brad contemplated while looking at his son's face, the son he managed to raise into a good man with his beloved wife. Why did he have to compare his life with other people, despite having a life full of happiness? Brad realized that life isn't a competition. All he had to do was just enjoy and be grateful for every second of his life.